All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. This is the fifth Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting for the proposed fees for removal fill permits and wetland delineations and determinations. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. Today's a pretty important meeting. We have a lot that we want to discuss and get RAC input and recommendations on. So I'll go over our purpose and agenda, and we can dive right in. So today we really have three key things that we're looking to do, which are to go over the rules and the fees and get your final input and show how your comments have been considered, and also get a recommendation from the Rulemaking Advisory Committee on a cost recovery model, and then also go over the impact statements. Maybe go to the next slide and I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. And we're actually going to change the agenda since folks have to jump off early. So today what we'll do is we'll start with the 9:45 topic, which is the cost recovery models. So as you know, in past meetings, we've the team has shown different options for fees at various cost recovery models from 60 to 73-ish to 85 to what's now 98, not 100%. And we want to get a recommendation from you all on what makes sense there. And you have made comments in past meetings, so the team will kind of review some of those as a reminder of what you've already said and really seek your recommendation. We're hoping to get a consensus recommendation on a cost recovery model from you all today, and we'll kind of strive to do that. And then we'll go back to the 9:15 topic, which is rule language and tiers follow-up. So here again, at past meetings, you all have given your input on rules and the various fee tiers for the divisions of the rules. And so the team is going to kind of go through comments that you've provided in the past and how they've been addressed through the rules, or just some responses to those comments, and see if there are any additional comments before wrapping up the rules. And then towards the end of the meeting, so this is the 11:20 topic on the agenda here. The team will present the three notices that are required in the rulemaking. So that's the fiscal impact statement, the racial equity impact statement, and the housing impact statement, and see if you have any comments on those. And again, you've been providing comments at past meetings to inform at least the fiscal and the racial equity impact statement. So the team will kind of review a few of those and how they've been incorporated and see if you have comments on that. And that might be a piece that we also seek input on after the meeting, since folks have to drop off and some won't be here. And then we'll end with interested party comments. So I know we have a few members of the interested parties here in the meeting. So thanks for joining, and we'll have time for your comments towards the end here. And then we'll just end with next steps and ending the meeting. And if we get to a consensus recommendation today, this may be our final meeting, but we'll still ask you to hold the November meeting in case we need another meeting. And Dana and team will go over that a little bit more later on. So that's the agenda. And let's jump into the next slide. So these are our Zoom protocols. I barely have to go over these again, but at the bottom of your screen, if you find the little react button or reactions, or maybe it just says raise hand depending on your platform, click on that, find the raise hand button, get your hand in the queue. If all else fails, just speak up and get off mute. But just stay on mute as you're not speaking, so we can reduce background noise, and use video when you can, especially when you're speaking, so we can kind of see each other in the room. And of course, we just encourage all of the good, respectful comments that you've all been providing so far. Stay respectful, sit in each other's shoes as we're making these comments moving forward. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're going to jump straight into the cost recovery models. And so again, I'll turn it over to Danielle in just a second. She's going to provide some background information on cost recovery and a little bit information presented in a little bit of a different way in response to some of the questions you've had in the past about what the cost recovery really means in terms of covering program costs overall. And then we want to get your recommendation on cost recovery. So we'll jump in there. And maybe before we jump in, anything from the committee about the process or what we're trying to do today? Okay. All right, then Danielle, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I created a new chart for us to look at to maybe get a better idea of where these cost recovery models land us. That red line at the top is our average expenditures. It's around 3,500. Oh my gosh, $3.5 million. And our estimated revenues based on our cost recovery models kind of shows you the weighting of each of these program areas, and where that gets us to our average expenditures. So you can see in the dark blue, we have the wetland delineations and determinations. The orange is the general authorizations. Green is individual permits and general permits and emergency authorizations. And blue is other income, such as civil penalties and things along those lines. And so those are all put together to kind of show the weighting of our revenues and where things are coming from. And as you can see, what we've talked about is the bulk of the estimated revenue is going to come in from the removal fill permits. And this is in an effort to keep the fees lower for wetland delineations and determinations and general authorizations. Are there any questions about this chart?
Just real quick, could you remind us as a reference what the current value is? For example, there's a line somewhere I guess you could place across the horizontal. That would be the current income. I think you guys have said 30% in the past.
That would have been an excellent thing to add. Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, you got it.
So we're at around 20%. So I'm going to say 20% cost recovery. That's going to put us, I think, at 1.3 million, somewhere around there. Maybe
Okay,
less than that.
Thank you. So if it's 1.3, let's just say for conversation's sake, somewhere in that ballpark.
Yeah.
Would the 60% recovery model then be about a 15 or 20% increase over sort of your current revenue, let's say?
It would be around 40% increase.
40. Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So when we looked at our current revenues, the average, we did a 5-year average of current revenues and expenditures to get to that 20%. And what we did was we just plugged in the estimated revenues for the removal fill permits and the wetlands into the same fiscal table to get an average of the 5-year of a 5-year. If we had been charging these fees over the past 5 years, where would we be with cost recovery? If that makes sense. You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to move on. The next 3 slides are just reminders of what the proposed fees are, which you should have gotten that a PDF or a link to a PDF of all 3 fee models together. So we have our wetlands fees, and I have up here what our current costs are. Just a reminder, wetland determinations are no cost, the on-site and the off-site. And we're going to keep the off-site determinations at no cost as well. And so then you can see our initial fee right now is $559. Resubmittal fee is $100. Then you can see what we're proposing up here. Yep. And then again, with the GAs, it's going to be a flat rate for all of the GAs. And currently there's only a $250 fee for overwater structures, filler removal GA, and temporary impacts to wetlands and waterways GA. So what's happening here is for GAs right now where the submission is no cost, there will be an increase in cost. And there will be an increase in cost for those other 2 GAs. And there will be a cost now to request a revise or transfer. And I know this chart is kind of a little jumbled because we have the applicant 1 types and the applicant 1 and 2 types. The first darker blue lines are the applicant 1 and the lighter blue lines are applicant type 2. And overall, there's going to be an increase for across the board. Currently, the max removal fill fee, the removal fee for a commercial operator, which is akin to the applicant type 2, is $999. And the private operator, which is akin to applicant type 1, is $736. And then the max fill fee is $1,590 for commercial and $999 for individual, private. Yes, Peggy.
Good morning. I have to
Good morning.
make sure my mute button works. Thank you. So I had trouble with this last night as I was reviewing. We are talking tiers 1 through 5 and types 1 and 2.
Yes.
And somehow or another, just for the future and for conversations at some point, I hope somebody can figure out some other clever way of delineating using different verbiage, because for people to, I'm thinking of people who are not used to the wetlands system and whether or not there's a different verbiage to explain the types versus the tiers. So anyway, so that's a concern. Go ahead.
Any recommendation is taken. This was the best we could come up with, and we are open to recommendations for renaming applicant type 1 and applicant type 2.
Yeah, not my skill set, but I hope somebody is clever enough to be able to figure out maybe some other way of doing it. The other thing I want to follow up on is, so you had a 98% with just the, a small set, about 200,000 or whatever. Those relate to the no cost that you just shared with us, and therefore you're picking up that no cost work and showing it as that area. Am I correct there?
Yes and no. What it was is we started with our lower fees and increased them by a certain amount for each cost recovery model, and the closest we could get to 100 was 98%. So we just wanted to have the same increase at each cost recovery model.
So who's covering the cost of the no cost? And I support the no cost ideas, don't get me wrong. I just want to make sure.
It'd be subsidized by the entire program.
Okay, that's helpful to know as well. And then the last question I have is that I understand that DSL has policy option packages asking for general fund dollars for help with the wetlands program in general. I'd like that confirmed, even though we don't know if the governor and or the legislature will actually approve those POPs.
I have to defer either to Dana or Ellie about that.
Hey, Dana.
Hi, Peggy. Yes,
Hi.
we do have legislative concepts in for addressing some of the staff resource needs, as well as responding to the governor's housing initiative. So Ellie might know more about it specifically if we're going in requesting general funds. I think that likely is the case, but Ellie can correct me if that is incorrect. But you are correct that those have been submitted, and we'll see how they go in our budget ask.
So I bring it up really quickly, and Ellie, you can answer the question, but I bring it up really quickly because it is important in the context of how much we're asking permittees to pay for and what else we might be working to help them in their work. And I think we ought not to ignore that context. So thank you.
Yeah, and Peggy, we do have 3 POPs that are related to the HPAC recommendations, and those do ask for general fund. So you probably know how to find our budget on our website, but if not, I can share it out. Or Danielle, maybe I can connect with you. And so if other folks wanted to see those POPs as well, I can point them to where to find them online in our agency request budget. But yeah, Peggy, feel free to reach out to if you have more questions about that.
So that's helpful, Ellie, and I hope that others can at least see those, because they may be a part of this discussion that we all might want to advocate for as we're dealing with the increase in permit fees. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. And Ellie, do you mind saying what HPAC is for folks that might not know?
Yes, thanks, Sylvia. That's the Housing Production Advisory Council, which is a collaboration between DLCD and the governor's office.
Well, it was made up mostly of the development community, specifically focused on affordable housing developers, but also others.
Thank you. And Samantha, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I have a question on the previous slide, but I also have some comments in line with what we're talking about. So I am totally in line with Peggy where I think we have to consider this in the context of what potentially might be given from the general fund. I think what would be helpful is if we're able to maybe hypothetically look at, okay, if these POPs, the HPAC POPs are fully funded, but then how will that parlay to the overall cost of implementing the program and exactly what we're talking about here? Because I'm have a little bit of a hard time contextualizing how those POPs might offset some of these costs, and then what that would look like depending on the cost recovery model. It's almost like we have 2 tandem conversations going that are interrelated, and it would be great if we could have a separate conversation and it doesn't have to be in the context of the rack of like how those are gonna work together here. So I'm open to having that conversation, and Peggy, if we want to get together with DSL, I'd offer a time saving standpoint and talk about that in more detail, I would be happy to do so. Then the comment, okay, so the question I have here is I don't fully understand the max removal fee and the max fill fee. So could we get a little bit more context on that?
Yes. So for the removal fee, if you're at a certain cubic yardage of removal, there's a set cost. And so the larger amount of material removal that you're applying for, the higher the cost is. So there's basically 3 for each removal or each fill permit. There are 3 levels of cost.
Okay.
So we're just looking at like what is the max that you would pay now.
Oh, this is the now. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
this is the now. Oh, sorry, I don't have
Got
current.
it.
I apologize.
Okay. Got it. I was like, I am not understanding. Okay.
Yeah,
Got it.
no, that's my fault for not having current in there.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great question. And Peggy, did you have a follow-up?
I did. Thank you very much. So just to be clear, the POPs are a separate set of work that that some of us are asking DSL to do to help in general with everybody dealing with wetlands, separate from a permit fee that actually deals with the processing of a specific permit. So although I believe there is a definite linkage, and I want to make sure that we have that conversation around being sure that DSL has these POP related programs, we still have to face the fact that we need to increase fees to some degree in order to more accurately pay for the program. And I just wanted to make sure that that was clear.
Thank you. And as far as the slides for the cost recovery models, that's the last one. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Sylvia for discussion.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so we want to kind of dive into the discussion on your recommendation for a cost recovery model. And maybe just in terms of, I know we do have a comment tracker that we sent out to folks that includes some of the comments, or hopefully most of the comments that you've made to date on the various pieces of the program, including cost recovery. Because we have limited time, I think maybe we can just go through this fairly quickly. It's just a reminder of what you all have already said on cost recovery and just a few of the DSL responses. Maybe Dana, do you want to kind of quickly breeze through this before we dive into discussion?
Sure, happy to. I think some of the comments we've heard that wetlands are a public good, and considering some different ways, including general fund, to maybe pursue any gap that remains in the cost recovery model selected. So we've noted that there are some costs that you thought should be kept low, like the wetland delineation and determinations. So we have reflected that in sort of the graph that Danielle showed, trying to keep some of those low. There was some conversation about potentially phasing in of fees, with lower fees at first and then increasing to get to the cost recovery over a 3 to 5 year period. We'll be prompting more discussion about that later. And we did consider the comment about charging a higher fee for applicants that want expedited service. We did bring that to leadership. We do feel that that would result, or could result, in less equitable treatment for Ogonians that aren't able to pay or afford a higher fee for expedited service. So we're not moving forward with that suggestion at this time. And then again, some things that we have considered was the offsite determinations. We're continuing to propose those as a continuing offsite determinations as a free service. And if partial cost recovery through fees is proposed, then we'll work with the state land board on, again, how to cover that gap. So just to clarify, the only thing we're proposing charging for that we don't now is the on-site, where staff goes out in the field. And then there was a suggestion to consider a lower cost recovery model to reduce burden on the housing industry. So while we do have that applicant type 1, and we expect a single homeowner would face lower fees, we do acknowledge that housing developments with larger impacts to wetlands are going to incur more cost, and that's based on the staff time it takes to review those types of projects. We noted the other recommendations about, some comments that you made about which cost recovery model you were leaning towards during conversations. So I think I'll just leave it there, Sylvia, and turn it back to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, we can probably take down the comment tracker. And I think what I'd want to do to start off this conversation is really just to go around the room and hear where you are on your leaning towards a cost recovery model. So you saw maybe if you don't mind just putting up that last slide with the percentages and the removal fill permits, just as an example. DSL has brought forward numbers related to a 60% cost recovery, 73%, 85%, 98%. We would just want to hear from you all which one of these are you leaning towards, or is there some other option that you would recommend and you would want to advocate for? And really most importantly is why. Why is that cost recovery option seem like it makes the most sense to you? And if a specific number like 60, 73, 85, 98, if you're not sure on the number, maybe it's more the why, what's important to you in terms of what a cost recovery model should achieve. So I do kind of want to go around the room, and I'll pick on everyone on the rack to just give a couple of sentences on where you are at this point. And then we can have, further discussion and then circle back and see if we have some kind of consensus around a model to recommend. But before I kind of do the round the table and give everyone a chance here, I want to make sure that everyone understands, and like if there's any clarifying questions that you want to ask to be able to provide your input, I'd welcome that right now. Any kind of clarifying questions from folks?
I have a quick one if I could. Thank you,
Yeah.
Sylvia. Just so I'm sure I'm clear on this one, 100% sure. If we voted, say, for 60% or 73 as a group, the consensus comes out that way. Are we saying that across the board and all the different programs and all the different tiers and fee structures proposed, that it would kind of reflect across the board those percentage increases, or I'm sorry, percentage of cost recovery rather?
I can respond to that unless DSL wants to make a more nuanced response.
I think I know the answer, but I just want to make sure I've got it right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I'll say that I think the answer is yes, unless you recommend something different, right? So if you were to say 60% is what you would recommend, then I think it would be equally around 60% for each of the different programs there. However, it can be a more nuanced recommendation where maybe you're saying 60% makes sense for the wetland delineations and determinations, but I would want it to be a little bit higher for individual and general permits. I think that would also be acceptable at this point, but I'll look to DSL to see if that's correct.
That is correct, and I think we would welcome those comments. I would just make sure everyone realizes, because the way we've done it is at the program level, not the individual level. So if we do change the percentage cost recovery for aspects of the program to get to the cost recovery model, that means they're going to have to go up or down for other areas of the program. So I think Sylvia explained that well, but I think that is just something I want to make sure everyone understands. We can do that, but it will change the numbers that you've been presented elsewhere, if that's the recommendation.
So just to make sure I understand, Dan, and thank you very much for that. That was helpful. I think you're suggesting that if we were to go to a, say, 60% recovery on one item, one fee structure, and not the same across the board, other ones might have to compensate, you might say, for that particular low number, and they may have to go higher, perhaps?
Not necessarily. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead, Daniel.
I think what Sylvia was saying is that, like, if you were like, oh, I like the cost recovery numbers, the fees at 60% for permits, for removal fill permits, but I think we could do the fees at 73% for general authorizations, we would be open to that. And what Dana is saying is that if you're saying that the fees for removal fill permits should be lower, we have to raise the fees somewhere else. So if you're saying the fees for removal fill permits should be less than 60%, we would need to raise the fees for GAs and wetland delineations. Correct, Dana?
Right, because to Dana's main point, I think, is you have to do a leveling at the end because it's an aggregate budget for the entire department, not sort of program by program. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thank you, Chris, for those questions. Others, any other clarifying questions to help you understand? All right, then I will just go around the table and ask, where you are at this point, with which cost recovery option are you leaning towards and why, or just any comments, you want to make generally around the cost recovery recommendation. And I'll just kind of go down my list of who's here. So I'll start with Brad, and then I'll go to Chris and John. So Brad, you get to go first.
Hi, everybody. I think what I would lean towards would be like a phased-in approach, starting at 60 and then phasing it towards 85 to 98. I don't know if it's on the table to try to pull the gap from the general fund or not, or if it's all just about getting us off the common school fund. But progressing towards that full cost recovery, at least to 85% is where I'm sitting.
Okay. Thanks, Brad. And anything you want to say about the why behind why that's an option you support? And it's a little bit
I just
hard to
think
hear you. Maybe if you lean in a little bit, it might be easier.
It just seems kind of silly to use the common school fund in this instance from a policy standpoint. So I think it makes sense to take us off of that for these programs. And whether we make up some of it in the general fund or not, I don't know if that's on the table, but just from a policy, just from a practicality, common sense standpoint, it really doesn't make any sense to me to use common school fund money to administer these programs.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brad. All right, and Chris?
I agree with Brad for the most part. I think we need to wean this program away from the school fund. I think we all probably agree to that principle. I am concerned though about sort of the shock, you might say, to the broader community that has to use these permits. So I think starting at the 60% level and moving upwards over time does make the most sense to me, especially if 60% is already I think 40% is what Danielle mentioned earlier, 40% increase on current. I think that's a pretty good improvement. And I want to not miss the message opportunity to the legislature that the public needs to have a portion of support for the program as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. And John?
Yeah, I actually agree with Chris. I mean, philosophically, and also with Brad, we want to protect the common school fund, obviously, but the shock factor is definitely going to be there. I look back at the applications that we work on, and they're going to be significant with full cost recovery. Getting there in time is fine, but the initial, I think, start low. We have a lot of tier 3 projects and utility projects for various agencies and jurisdictions, etc. And I was looking at one the other day that was going to go up to $24,750. And I thought, wow, if they hit with that, that's going to be a shock. And it's a temporary impact, restored area, but nevertheless, it's going to cost a lot of money to review. So I would say start low, and let's work higher as we get, as we go further along.
Yeah, thank you, John. And maybe I'll also ask, and Brad and Chris can jump in too, and then we'll continue. But I'm hearing this kind of support for starting at around 60 and then moving up. Do you have thoughts on what that looks like, that ramp up, over how many years, for example? And if not, that's okay, but I'll just put you on the spot, John.
That's a good question. I don't have I think that, obviously they're too low now. There's no doubt about that. And so this process obviously is very important, but yeah, I would say over several years, but that's kind of a wishy-washy answer, I realize.
Okay.
Something that, you can get the folks used to, that yes, there's going to be an increase, and see where it goes. I was always shocked at how low the increase was, for instance, for wetland delineations. It just very incrementally went up, like 559 this year. And I was thinking it's got to be higher than that, but obviously it will be in the future.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Chris or Brad, did you have anything more specific than, over several years that you would want to recommend? It's okay if you don't, but just to.
Well, thanks for asking, Sylvia. For me, I think a minimum would be about a 5-year period. I think that seems reasonable, sort of hits a nice balance in my mind regarding those applicants that will need to respond and begin to make those adjustments. That seems like the right kind of time frame. And again, just to echo what I said earlier, I'd sure like to provide a larger window, a wider window for the legislature to continue to take this issue up because it is an important one. And I know there's a lot of public good served by the program as well. Thank you.
Okay. And Brad, I see your thumbs up in support of what Chris said there. Thank you. All right, then I'll keep moving around the table. Next let's go to Katie and then Michael and then Peggy. Kind of what your recommendation would be at this point. And of course, we'll discuss and see where we are. Go ahead, Katie.
Hi, yeah, I think I tend to agree with what's been said so far. I think concern with the shock factor. So starting low and progressing high. I would I think agree with what Brad was saying that at least 85%, if not the 98, should be what we should aim to get to over the years. And yeah, I don't have a set time frame necessarily in mind. And then I also just want to echo Chris's comments around making sure the legislature has a chance to really understand the public good piece of this as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. And Michael?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding, echoing here, I just want to paint the picture here. Our members for the League of Oregon Cities, I mean, we're facing, a lot of racks from like a lot of different fee increases, and there's various reasons for that. And while I don't have like, in terms of like a good report and sort of the depth and breadth of the impact that our members would face on this, I think definitely leaning toward a phased in approach and starting at that lower end makes a lot more sense. I mean, just maybe a touch bit out of scope is like, in other work groups, I mean, we're facing 135% fee increases for different stuff. So I think in concert, it's like very challenging for our members to have, continual fee increases, while, I certainly respect what's been said about, the common good and kind of moving away from that. So all that said, I think starting at the lower end, definitely with a phased in, no sort of real timeline. But I think somebody mentioned, what is the question, ultimately the legislature's ability to do this is, what does it look like for general fund to like make up any difference or sort of thing. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Peggy?
Oh, this is fun. Thank you all. So, so I agree that we start at 60% for all of the reasons that everybody has said, including Michael's last comments about all the different permits that are going to need some increases. And I'm going to offer a minimum of 2 years, but frankly, I'm looking at maybe a 4-year, every 4-year phase in. I'm looking at biennial discussions to see whether or not that makes sense. And I'm also agree with Katie that 85% is probably the max I'd be ready to support, because it really is a public good as well. And I can argue about whether or not the Common School Fund is the right thing or not. It has been the right thing for a long time, because it is these are waters of the state, and the Common School Fund is responsible for the lands of waters of the state. So I guess I don't have as much of an angst about the Common School Fund issue. And I do think that we just absolutely need to have an increase, and that's why we supported this. But I am very concerned. I also do want to make sure that the recommendation for when it moves forward beyond 60, that it is something that people can plan for. And I don't know if 2 years is too small a time frame, and whether or not it needs to be a 4-year. And that would be a conversation I would be interested in hearing from others about, simply for business planning purposes. But that's the concept, and the amount we are learning, and all of the agencies are learning, not to wait a long time to let people know that there's going to be a fee increase, that we need to do this on a regular basis. So that's the other part. We are now talking about 60% and what these numbers are, but a 60% 2 years from now may be a different number because of the cost of staff and the cost of services and whatever. So we need to, however this process works with this particular rack, we need to make sure that that is pays in. And I think you have suggested a 5% annual increase for that general bump forward. And I think that's a good conversation as well. DEQ does 3% and it's just not enough. I think I've talked enough. Thank you.
Right. Yes, thank you, Peggy. Yeah, and thank you for bringing up the 5% increase annually for dealing with inflation. And that is something we've talked about at past meetings. And it sounded like folks were okay with that number generally, but if anyone has additional comments there, that would be helpful. All right, well, let's keep going. Let's go to, oh, and actually, I see Jessica just joined. Thank you for joining, Jessica. Nice to see you. All right, let's go. And Jessica, we just to bring you up to speed, and I think you do have your primary here as well. So we'll have Michael speak on behalf of League of Oregon Cities today, but thank you for joining, appreciate it. We're just kind of going around the table to get an initial hearing from everyone on what they feel like the right cost recovery recommendation would be for the fees in general.
Sounds good. I'll just listen in.
Great, thank you, Jessica. All right, let's go to Samantha and then Stephanie. Samantha?
Sure. So, I say this with the caveat that my board has not reviewed any drafts, or we don't obviously have a notice yet. So, this is not a formal position of HBA. And I say all of this with the caveat that once my board gets a hold of it, we could take a different position. But I think at this point, we're uncomfortable with any of the cost recovery models presented. We think 60% is too high, and that it's going to be a significant sticker shock for people who have to get these permits, who are already expending an exorbitant amount of money to operate within the scope of this program, as well as every other state agency program right now. We also think that this is potentially going to have a disparate impact on affordable housing developers who are building in a very difficult environment on very thin margins and highly dependent upon subsidies. So any sort of additional fee makes building that product more and more difficult. And this is certainly not the only fee increase that they're going to be seeing. And so I don't think we're feeling good about this right now. I think 40% would probably be a more palatable option with a phased in approach. But I say that saying that we will probably not ever be supportive of a full cost recovery model, and think that this conversation needs to go back to the legislature to have a conversation about general fund, because this program is for the greater good of Oregonians. And I think it's unfortunate that we're in a situation where we've got the common school fund and school folks pinned against affordable housing, pinned against food producers, pinned against private property owners, et cetera. So it doesn't feel like the underlying framework for funding this program makes a lot of sense. And so we need to go back to the legislature with that.
All right, thank you, Samantha. And Stephanie?
I mostly agree with what everyone said about if we have to start somewhere, start at 60 and work it up slowly. It's, I guess my biggest thing is eventually I'd like to see the applicant type reviewed, just because it puts a burden on people who are just trying to.
And sorry, Stephanie, I'm gonna interrupt for just a second. It's pretty hard to hear you. Maybe if you
Sorry, is this better now?
That's better, thank you.
Okay, sorry, it's a weird setup in here. I was just saying, I agree with starting at 60 and working up slowly. And as Peggy said, on the schedule, so people can plan for it. I would like to eventually see the applicant type review to maybe include municipalities in that type 1. Just because it's less cost related and more no, it's cost related. I'm not gonna lie, it's hard to keep infrastructure going with so many costs and regulations and holdups and for something that already exists. So I would like to see that eventually, but as far as cost recovery, I guess starting at 60% and just be ready for that shock factor that everyone is talking about, because that's a pretty big jump.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate that. All right. And Michael did let me know, Jessica, that you'll now be the primary because Michael had to hop off. So thank you for joining today. Appreciate that. Okay, well, I feel like what I've heard from you all, just to recap a little bit here, in general, I think all of you are concerned about, you know, what's being called the shock factor to folks that pay these fees, you know, having to go up so quickly. I'm hearing a lot of support for a phased in approach. Hearing a lot of support too for using general funds, although that is going to be a different conversation outside of this rack, but hearing that that's really important and getting the legislature to understand that this is a public good piece. And really in terms of a, you know, specific recommendation, I'm also hearing just in general support and maybe one or two not quite supportive of starting at a 60% cost recovery and then moving up over some period of years to something closer to, I heard more support for 85 than 98, but something in that range. So just kind of echoing back what I'm hearing from the group. And so I think I'll like turn it back to you all now to see if you want to ask each other questions or make comments to one another to see if we can get to a place of having a, you know, a consensus recommendation from this rack. And I'll say process wise, I think what we would hope for is, you know, that you all get to a pretty specific consensus recommendation on the cost recovery percentage. And if we don't get to a full consensus, which means you can all live with it, then DSL would bring forward to leadership just sort of the different opinions that were heard here. And maybe there's a majority and a minority or something along those lines. And Chris, I see your hand up.
Yeah, sorry for jumping in. I have a bad habit that I've created over this.
No bad habits. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think we're pretty close to consensus, actually, as I've heard the group go through their positions. I didn't know we were looking at an upper limit, by the way, so I think I also concur that 85-ish% is probably as high as I would want to go. But I think we're really, really close to consensus, actually. So I want to just throw some inspiring words in there, I guess, to get us started on that discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris. Samantha.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just be clear, you don't have consensus from HBA. We aren't supportive of any of the concepts that have been outlined so far. And we don't have every member of the RAC here today. So it's totally cool if we disagree on things, but I just want the department to be clear that there's not consensus.
Right, I apologize. Not consensus, but close to consensus is what I was trying.
Yes, and Samantha, thank you for pointing out that we do not have all members of the committee here. I did hear from, let me pull up my notes for just a second. Efren Zamudio, who's with the Oregon School Boards Association, and from Morgan Allen with the Coalition of Oregon School Administrators. And they had similar comments that they wanted to bring in today, that they support a phased in process over several years and getting to as much as of a fuller cost recovery as possible to reduce the impact on the common school fund. So those are their comments that they've brought in. I'm not going to say anything else on their behalf because they're not in the room. So, you know, just maybe consider those as you're kind of discussing here today. But I have not heard from Phil Scholes, who is our other RAC member that's not here, as well as from Lauren Poor. All right. Anyone else have kind of questions for each other or comments you want to make to one another? And maybe, Samantha, I'm hearing from you that the proposal that's on the table is not in line with what HBA would want. Is there anything that folks would want to ask Samantha, or, just any discussion there that might be helpful? Peggy?
So Samantha, I hear you, and that's why I brought up the additional DSL pops, because we are hopeful that if we can get general fund for those actions, they will provide some information for developers to a level that when you actually go for a permit, it will be less challenging, and or you will have the information ahead of time to know whether or not you even ought to consider that particular piece of property because of the facts that you have on the ground that you won't have to do yourself by hiring a contractor and whatever, because it will be information that is public knowledge. So that's the part about this conversation, because I certainly hear you and I understand. And as Michael said from League of Oregon Cities, we know that DEQ and WRD are all looking at huge increases in permit fees. So I hope that that's helpful, but I also understand your position. Thanks.
I appreciate those comments, Peggy. I don't think there's a lot of mystery of where I'm coming from here for the group. Like, I think everyone knows this is a numbers thing. I also will just say I feel a little bit like I'm the only person besides the publics who are here from like the regulated community who represents applicants generally. And so my comments even go outside of HBA a little bit, where I'm like, I know that potentially, specifically depending on the housing project, depending on the type of development, those costs could potentially be spread out and not be much to absorb depending on the cost recovery model. But we have farmers that are going to have to pay for these, and there's nowhere to spread those costs out. We have other types of development that aren't going to be able to spread those costs out. And so I will just tell the group, while I think HBA has concerns, I think there are other entities, once these rules go out for notice, who will have far greater concerns than I. And so I just feel but that's where I'm coming from, and I appreciate your comments, Peggy, and I'm hoping we can all move forward. I don't know if we can do it in the context of this RAC and in the time frame, but having a better conversation with the legislature of like, I don't want us to be in a RAC again where we all actually agree on the underlying principles, but there's no other money to come around. So we're all, fighting over, what can be what. I mean, I think it just feels like we have to have a greater conversation about the funding model in general, but that's not for this RAC to really do.
Could I make a quick comment in support of the farming community, the ag community, because we do work a lot in working lands, even though we do conservation work in the watershed. Is it possible that we might consider land zoning, the actual zone that the land is in, as part of an additional tier or variable price structure for these permits? In other words, if you're on EFU ground, perhaps your permit should be half or thereabouts of whatever the going rate would be for that activity, as it lines up with the different tiers. Just as a wild suggestion, I guess.
Maybe on that, was that a question specifically for DSL?
No, I'm sorry. I was trying to respond to the comments about protecting, if you will, or considering the impacts of these fee increases to the farming community, ranching community, and those kinds of land uses, I guess, specifically, if I heard the comment a moment ago. I think that's very legitimate. I just wanted to echo some support, and I think that's a legitimate concern for sure that we should all be considering more.
Okay, so maybe some kind of different fee for agricultural lands or EFU lands.
Yes, because the land use system in Oregon already has that determination or that sort of designation in place. So maybe we could kind of use that to our advantage in this case and just set up a much lower fee for the same kinds of activities in those zones specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And well, I guess Samantha, do you have any thoughts on that? I see other hands, but I just, since Samantha brought up the comment initially, if that's helpful.
Well, then that leaves you, I mean, you could do that, but then that, in the spirit of fairness, then that leaves the home building community and the other communities shouldering. It feels a little bit more targeted at that point. But I think that's definitely something that could be explored. And I'm only here on this rack with my HBA hat on and not any other hats. So I don't want to really speak further on that for anybody else.
Sure. Thank you. Peggy and then Brad.
Yeah, so Samantha got it right on the head. Yes, there are those concerns, but somebody has to pick up the difference. So if we provide this exemption for the ag community, then the home building community will have to see an increase beyond what we're already suggesting. So just remember that whenever you do any of those kinds of things, you have to continue to rebalance the numbers. So I'm certainly a supporter of the ag community. The league is definitely a supporter of the ag community, but I have real concerns about those kinds of actions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And Brad.
Yeah, for folks that don't work in this world, this regulated world, there are broad exemptions for agricultural activities, very broad. So there's already a lot that they can do with their land. Just in case folks are interested, check out the rules. There's broad exemptions.
Okay. All right, thank you. So there already are some broad exemptions for agricultural lands, ag activities. Okay. And maybe DSL, as you're hearing this conversation, anything that you want to ask or comment on? Okay, well, I know that some folks have to drop off, maybe even now. So I do want to do one thing before, and I know we're not quite at consensus, but I just want to see where we are on a general proposal. Because I'm hearing some support for cost recovery being phased in. Thank you, Chris. Cost recovery being phased in to allow for progressively higher fees over a period of some number of years, which maybe we have to figure out what that is, beginning with 60% at year one and eventually getting to 85% as an upper limit. And I'm actually going to share my screen. Oh, can you stop sharing your screen, Danielle? And again, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, so I'm putting this up as just sort of a little bit about what I'm hearing the most sort of support for is kind of phasing in, starting at 60% and eventually getting to 85%. So I think I would want to maybe just get a hand raise. Well, before I do the hand raise, does anyone have any? I know there's at least one person in the room who will completely not agree with this. And so I hear you, but I just want to see how many folks are generally on board with this kind of proposal. But if you have words that you'd want to add here before we kind of see where folks are, I support that. So Peggy and Jessica, let me see if you have questions or comments.
So I just want to make sure that you also add the 5% annual increase as a part of this conversation, because people need to understand that
That is
as
a
well.
good point.
That's a significant issue. Thank you.
Annual increase to adjust for inflation or something like that. That's in the rules. Thank you, Peggy, for that reminder. Jessica?
I don't necessarily have any additional comments to add. This is just what Michael told me that LOC was supporting at this time. So.
Okay, so
but
you're raising your hand in support. Okay,
I'm raising my hand in support of that
Okay,
proposal.
perfect.
Yeah,
That's
I mean,
great.
I think it's a fair place to start.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll ask for hand raises of support for this general proposal, just so we kind of get a straw poll of where we are at this point. So if this looks good to you, go ahead and raise your hand and I'll make a note and keep it up. Don't take it down because it's hard to remember who all raised their hand and to be able to see.
Could I just ask a quick clarifying point? You still have X years in the current proposal. Is that something you want us to decide on as a second decision point or rally point?
That's it. Well, maybe we could decide that now before we do the hand raises. Does anyone have a suggestion for the X years?
I can lead out with one. I think it should be a minimum of 5 years or 3 biennia. I guess either one of those works for me.
Okay. And Peggy, I saw for your hand go up with the number 4. So over a period of 4 years. Okay. Chris, would you have concern about 4?
No.
So maybe I'll put that in and then see where folks are with hands. This is all just words on a page. This isn't final language, so we're all just talking here. Okay, still see hands up, and I know we lost some members. And Samantha, I see your hand is not up, which I completely understand. But in general, I'm seeing support from the folks that are in the room here on this proposal. And I'm going to write down your name so I don't forget, because I know we lost a couple of members already today that had to hop off. Okay.
I guess for my 2 cents, Sylvia, I'd say
go ahead,
I liked when you mentioned like 3 biennium, but which
You
would
liked
be
3
I think,
biennium more?
6 years. So
okay, and maybe I'll ask Peggy why the 4, because earlier I thought I heard you saying you would want a longer time frame, so that was surprising to me as well.
Actually, I don't think I did indicate. So the 4 years is because I know the pressure from the state school from the state land board about this movement, and I have been a part of the conversation. So I'm guessing that they want more cost recovery earlier, and so I am trying to find a compromise. And I think if we push for 4, they may listen. I'm not sure that they'll be happy with 6. I just in part because of where the money comes from, because until things change, it will still come from the Common School Fund. And so that's why I'm looking at 4.
I see. So it seems like it might be more palatable to the DSL leadership and the board. Jessica, I'll head back to you with thoughts on that.
I think that that's a valid point from Peggy, I guess. I'm thinking more about some of the heartburn that RAC members have on the price increases overall and those paying the fees. So I feel like certainly one could say that if the board is interested in fee recovery, then that might motivate them to look at general fund sources and evaluate, kind of to Samantha's point and have those conversations. But considering there's just a lot of struggle and reaction to the cost recovery percentages in general, smoothing it out over a longer period of time might make it more palatable.
Mm-hmm.
I can't raise my hand because it's already up. I apologize.
You can take your hands down now. Thank you.
I didn't want Jessica to stand alone on that 3 biennium thing though. So yeah, if the group is okay with a range like you've just typed in, I'm very supportive of 3 biennia. Thank you.
So I just want to remind everybody that DSL has not had any general fund. related to this program. And so you really do need to get it in the context of the political reality of the fact that we're actually beginning to ask for some general fund for this program, even outside of the fee part of it. Just the other issues that I mentioned, the POPs have never had general fund asks before. Matter of fact, DSL's general fund is, I think the Elliott State Research Forest issue was like the very first time that they got any general fund money for their agency at all. So that's the context from which I'm coming. I'm happy to see 4 to 6 years. That's fine with me. But you just need to understand the reality of what's happened over the years. And I attend the school board, the state land board meetings all the time, so I listen to the decision makers.
Great, thank you, Peggy. And Chris, your hand is still up. Is there another comment there?
Just super quick. Yeah, I full respect to what Peggy just said about the political reality. I would just note that we are talking at the 60% recovery level, a 40% increase over current permit fees. And I think that's also an important message to tag along with the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So I think what I'm hearing is the message is, sort of finding this balance between knowing that the board will want more cost recovery earlier on, but want to avoid kind of shock to the community in raising fees too quickly, too soon. So that may have to be a decision that's made at that level. And I'll ask DSL, would you want to see more specificity in the range here of phasing in, or is something like 4 to 6 years appropriate here? Do you want us to have more conversation for you to be able to make your recommendation?
I think my question is, I just want to understand this better, where everybody's coming from, which I don't disagree on the phasing in approach. But is the recommendation to start off at 60% fees and then go to that 73% fees and then the 85% fees? So we would not be doing that 5% annual increase, but in 2 years going to 73% fees. Or I'm seeing Peggy shaking her head. Do 60% increase by 5%, jump up to the 73%, increase by 5, and then jump up to the 85.
That's it.
Yeah, I saw Peggy nod yes, but any concerns about that from Danielle? I understand DSL would want to get a little bit more specific about what does this really look like year to year?
So I just want to make sure that, so that's why I wanted to make sure that the 5% was in this discussion, because you need to understand all of the effective increases and not just the percentage.
And so then there's for those that are in agreement to start off at 60% and eventually get to 85%, there is agreement to go up 5% in the in-between years.
That's a good question. So folks, yeah, so Chris, I see a thumbs up from you. Does everyone understand that this would be a 5% annual increase, kind of on top of the increases that are here due to cost recovery? Maybe just say that you're concerned if you have concerns. All right, I'm seeing thumbs up from folks.
I mean, is it necessary if we're going from 60 to 73 and then 85%? Is the extra 5% necessary until we get to that? Go ahead, Peggy.
Yes. So Stephanie, the costs are going to go up for the agency, irrespective of what the percentage is on permits. There's going to be an increase in staff costs. It's going to be an increase in inflation costs. And so those have to be accommodated for. And so not paying attention to the percentage increase of the fees from 60 to 73 to 85, but on top of that, the actual cost of doing business is that 5%. And so you wouldn't have, if you didn't do the 5%, you wouldn't actually be getting to 73 and 85. in the future.
Thank you, Peggy. And go ahead, Dana.
I just had a question. Danielle, I heard you say the 5% every other year. I'm wondering, compared to every year, which I think is what I hear Peggy more saying, every year should be a 5% increase and then jumping up in addition to 75. So I feel like I need it like laid out, like year one, year two, so we can make sure we're all on the same page would be helpful for me. And maybe we can do that during the break and come back to that. But
so just to follow up with that really quickly, it's my understanding that you are expecting somewhere about a 4.5% increase in costs of doing business every year. And so therefore you have to have that kind of a cost, the 5% annual increase just to do business, irrespective of this 60%, 73. And so if I'm incorrect on that, that's different. But otherwise, that's what I understood. It was an annual increase. And I do know that that's true with the DEQ permits, is that they do a 3%, and then they're always behind, and we have to adjust every 4 to 6 years.
Okay.
I think the recommendation, Sylvia, was 85% at year 5.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure.
So year 2 would be a 5% increase, and then year 3 would be at the 73%. And year 4 would be a 5% increase, and year 5 would be 85. I think that's what I was hearing.
All right, we'll put some new numbers up here and I'll ask for a raise of hands again in just a second. Okay, so a 60% increase or 60% cost recovery for year 1. And then additional 5% for inflation at year 2. Is that right? I know these words might not be perfect, so let's just get agreement on the general concept. And then 73% cost recovery for year 3.
I thought we were going 4 to 6. So it wouldn't be year 3, it would be year 4 or 5 or 6.
Oh, great. Maybe I was misunderstanding where we were, or we should clarify with the group. Is it that we get to 85% at the end of the 4 to 6 year period, or is that there is a bump every 46 years? Because that's a different question.
Yeah, so my understanding was it was the latter. It was not getting to 85 in 4 to 6 years, but doing the increase every 4 to 6 years.
I get it.
So your 85 would be longer than that.
And that may be a place where others are, I'll check with others, but maybe quickly, Samantha, check with you.
Yeah, I actually have to go. I just want to say I feel a little uncomfortable with the process right now. It feels like we are kind of writing some things on the fly. And a lot of us have internal processes that we have to follow to kind of check things over before we can give formal comments or like positions on things. And so I understand if this is just a general brainstorming exercise, I think that is okay. But if we're going to be kind of writing things on the fly and then asking people to vote or indicate a position, I don't really think it kind of puts people on the spot who maybe haven't had the opportunity to actually take this back through their own internal processes. And so I would just say I'm a little uncomfortable right now with what's happening, especially because we don't have every member of the RAC here.
Yeah, I do kind of want to echo what Samantha said, because my understanding is we weren't really like making any official decisions today. We're just sort of brainstorming potential options that the RAC could support when we get to a future meeting where we're really making decisions. I do just want to clarify that, because we have kind of changed there's a lot of stuff that got added to this sheet in the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the hard work, and this is where the words get on a page so that we can try to figure out a recommendation and appreciate. And Samantha, thanks for pointing out that kind of you're uncomfortable with the process and need to check with people outside of this room. I do think we're just kind of putting up some words here so that we can figure out if there's a there. And this does not in any way have to be, a final recommendation today. I know that the hope from DSL was maybe to get to a final recommendation today, but if folks have to check with others outside the room, maybe I'll see DSL where you are on that, on having another meeting and I know that's maybe a decision to decide after today, but any thoughts on kind of what you're hearing from Samantha and Jessica?
So I'm going to leap in before they answer. I think we have a partial answer to assist with Samantha's issue and Jessica's, that somewhere in this piece of paper towards the end, there is a sentence that says, not everybody is in agreement, or we still have people who are uncomfortable. There needs to be a sentence in this document on the proposal that indicates that we still have a few people who are uncomfortable with the process, the recommendation. And that at least would be more helpful to me, and I think even
Sylvia, if I could, I mean, I think this is just framing up what could be the first option. I mean, I know we don't want to get into a big option matrix or anything like that down the road, but I think there's more work clearly to be done. This seems like a reasonable starting point. We've put some things on paper for people to think about and react to, but I didn't assume for any minute that we were going to try to close this discussion today. I assumed we were going to have to follow this up, knowing what the roster looked like for today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I am comfortable if this is the final meeting, knowing if it's so long as, staff makes clear in the staff report that you didn't get a consensus agreement, and anyone who raised their hand today, no one's really prepared to say yes or no on this. It's okay if you want to have like a general temperature check of if you're headed in the right direction, like that's fine. But we are where we are, and ultimately at the end of the day, my organization's not going to make any formal comment until I see a proposed rule and a public notice. And so, to me, I just wanted to flag that because it felt like we were morphing things pretty far away from, I didn't think we were going into this meeting making votes. And then I think we're just kind of morphing things a little bit, but I have to go. But if this, I don't feel the need to have another meeting personally. And again, my organization's not going to be making formal comment until we see some actual rule language and a public notice.
Great. Appreciate that, Samantha. And before you go, I would want maybe you to think about if there is a general consensus from the group on something similar to what's up on the screen here, and then there's a group like including yourself and maybe others that are not in the room today, maybe consider how you would want that to be presented to leadership, whether through a minority statement or some other proposal that you would want to bring forward. And I know you have to go, so I'm not going to make you stay on much longer, but maybe be thinking about that, and we can be in touch about that.
Consensus is a relative term, right? To me, consensus means everyone agrees. I don't think you have everyone who agrees. And I think once this goes out to public notice, there were many people that weren't included on this rack and organizations that weren't included on the rack who are going to have strong opinions about this. So I don't think you have consensus, but at the end of the day, that's a relative term, and you might have consensus, and it doesn't necessarily matter.
Great. Thank you, Samantha. And maybe I shouldn't have used the word consensus, but more we could put forward to leadership. There are different ways that committees might put forward their recommendation is we do have a consensus. Woohoo! And there's one recommendation that moves forward, Or we could put something forward that is a majority of RAC members agreed with XYZ, and then a minority report where, you know, it's something else. So it could be like a majority minority type recommendation moving forward. And that might be where we are at this point. Would, and she did have to hop off. Okay. It's always so hard when we can't get everyone in the room. It makes it a challenge for sure. But appreciate everyone sticking with it today. So I'll head back to where we are on this proposal. And we were in the middle of kind of laying out more specifics on what happens every year. And I think there was question about, well, I know, Peggy, I'm hearing from you, you want a longer time frame overall. And I'll go to others. Brad, Chris, Stephanie, and Jessica, to see what your thinking was. Was it that we would eventually get to 85% at the end of this 4 to 6 year period, or that there is a jump every 4 to 6 years?
I'll start off. It's the former. It was a longer extended period to get to 85 in my mind.
Yeah, I concur with that.
I'm flexible on the timeline.
I was actually under the impression that it was as you were writing it, but I am more agreeable to the longer timeline. So let's go with that.
We have to give Peggy credit for that one, I think.
So let's try on some words here. Let like year by year, maybe are these first 3 years looking okay?
No, because you have 73% after year 3. And what you need to have is some other 5% for year 3. And then year 4, you get to 73. So you have to do the additional 5% you have to have that line again there, only for year 3. And then you move to year 4. And then you do those 2 additionals after the 73. And then you get to whatever that number is with the 7, 7, I guess.
All right, I'm going to try this on and see how that is. So I think this is essentially, I'll just put over a progressive period, take the years out here. So it's not there. Okay, so let's try this on. So 60% cost recovery at the first year, and then we're just doing the inflation adjustments for the next couple of years. Then at year 4, you get the jump to 73. And then at year 7, I suppose it would be, you would get the jump to 85%. So, and again, I'm just putting words on a page to start a conversation. So I'll turn to folks to see how this is looking if you have adjustments. Jessica?
Did I get that right?
Well, yeah, I feel like maybe this is where a little bit more time for us to digest seeing it like this would be helpful. Maybe I wasn't totally understanding how the 5% was playing into things earlier, but looking at it like this seems kind of clunky to me. Because if I'm understanding it right, by year 3, we're at 70%. And so then for year 4, we're doing a 3% increase. It would shorten the timeline, but would it just make sense to do the 5% increases over time until we get to 85%? And then, you know what I'm saying? But maybe I'm not understanding how the 5% inflation factor plays into the numbers.
Well, the 5% is different. So the 73% is the cost of the permit, but it's different from the five. Well, somebody else can help me with the math.
Yeah, I
But
might
I
actually
think this
turn
is right.
to DSL to see how you would see this playing out with the
Well,
5%
just real
inflation on
quickly,
top.
once a
Because I
cost
feel like if the
recovery-
5% yearly inflation factor is separate from what we're talking about with maybe like saying the
It
base
is.
percent increase of like 60, 73, 85. I think we were trying to help explain things by including it, but it might be better in this case to pull that aside and just note that there will be an additional 5% annual increase to the base increase each year,
Yes.
and then lay out the pathway from 60 to 85, in which case over 7 years or 6 years sounds great. I think the math with the 5% was kind of throwing me off.
It's also tricky because on the one hand, we're comparing apples to oranges, cost recovery increases versus actual percent of budget increase. So just as a side note, when we talk about actual increases to the permits themselves, those are more like 100, 300% when you look back at the table.
Right, but this, what we're talking about when we say 60, 73, 85 is percent of program funded from fees.
Yes,
Right.
correct.
Yeah.
Okay, I still
That's
got that. I still got that right.
Yeah, I'm sorry if it was confusing, but dealing with people who, from the other permit people that I talk to, they want to know what it's going to cost them, period. And so I don't want to forget that
Sure.
that those dollar numbers that are today frozen are not going to be frozen next year or the year
Right.
after.
It might be helpful, like when we come back at the next meeting, to see this information in a table that's kind of tracking the cost recovery percentages over time, and then your inflation, and then kind of getting us to a total. I could see that being helpful for the RAC to look at. So I guess then the question is it better to start at the 60% and have it at that for 3 years, and then come back in year 4 and have essentially a 13% increase in fees for cost recovery to the program? Or is it better to phase that out as an annual percent increase amount? Is that kind of what we're talking about now? Like, do we like the way that it looks now, that it starts at 60 and then in 4 years it goes up to 73%? Or do we want there to be an increase each year from 60 to 73 and from 73 to 85? Is that kind of the question in front of us now?
Interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. But there are different numbers. When you start adding the 5%, it's still a percentage difference, but it's the dollar amounts are definitely different.
Right, so Jessica, I think you're asking, could it be something like where we have 60% for year 1, and then for year 2 and 3, there's some percentage increase before we get to 73% in year 4.
Right.
But then the 5% would be on top of all
5%
that.
every year until we get to 85, right? Or something like that. And I don't know, that would be another one, I guess I'd probably have to think on whether LOC would have an opinion on one of those approaches.
Mm-hmm.
You know, would be more in
Okay.
favor of one of those approaches than the other. I'm not sure. I think if it was 5% every year, this change would happen in 5 years. We'd get to 85% cost recovery in 5 years versus 7. Is that right? Maybe.
I don't think so. And just so you know, Jessica,
6 years.
frankly, with DLCD and DSL's POPs, LOC is supposed to gain some additional assistance to do wetlands delineation work. And that's, as you're worried about the cost of a permit specific, there is help in both DLCD's budget as well as DSL's budget, assuming that all gets to the governor's budget and through the legislature. for help for LOC members.
Well, I'm very much an alternate, Peggy, so I appreciate that you think I'm super in the know, but not necessarily.
Which is why I was sharing.
Thank you.
I'm a budget person.
And Jessica, I'm hearing from you and maybe from others as well, that it would be helpful to see actual dollar amounts in the table. And maybe DSL, can you comment on that? Like, what is there information that could be brought forward
Well,
to the rec?
I mean, dollar amounts, sure, because we know how much the fees are now and then how much they'd be increasing under these different proposals. But I think to, I guess, sort of Peggy's point, like being mindful of, we're talking about the cost recovery percentages, but DSL is also asking for that annual 5% increase for inflation. I mean, I'm sure this is going back a little bit, but just an automatic 5% increase in inflation. I mean, what if inflation is not at 5% each year? Are we then, like, if the inflation keeps getting added and for whatever reason, it's more than like actual inflation rates? Is DSL then sort of getting more cost recovery than they, they'll be going over the 5%? Or I mean, over the 85% eventually, theoretically.
So that's a fair conversation, Jessica. What I can tell you is that just saying inflation, it doesn't say CPI, and it's very important because state agencies' costs are overweighted to staff cost increase rather than CPI numbers. So all I can tell you is from experience is that DEQ has had a 3% annual increase for a number of years that they've been able to do with their water permits, and it just has not covered. So every 4 to 6 years, we have to come back and change and ask for more money to cover just current service level costs on those fees.
Sure. I mean, I guess it's more of the theory behind it than how it would actually play out, that the likelihood that inflation is less or whatever kind of cost increases that number is supposed to cover, but it's not, it is kind of giving the department the blank go ahead to make that increase every year, regardless of, economics or costs.
Mhm.
It is just kind of the rubber stamp to increase the fees.
And Danielle, did you have a comment on that?
I will say, so when we're looking at the 607385, remember it's total program cost recovery. And so if we're increasing the individual fees by 5% every year, so I've been looking at it. So for example, tier 1 for the wetland delineations is $600 at 60%. To increase that by 5% gets us to $630. And then increase that by 5% gets us to just over $660. And so the 5% increase every year does not necessarily get us to 85% at year 5. So if you're wanting to gradually increase to get to that 73%, we would maybe want to look at in year 2 increasing by the difference of a third of between the 60% and 73%. So like 600 times 30%, and then by 30%, and then we get to the 850. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, that there would still be kind of a bigger jump if we were to do 5%, then go to the 73% fees. There would still be a significant jump.
Yeah, I mean, it might be helpful for the department to put that together in a way that
I agree.
RAC can see it.
Mhm.
I agree.
Okay, so maybe that's what we could do for the next meeting is try to package this up with some additional detail for discussion at the next meeting, because at this point we also just don't have a quorum of members in the room. And I think we do need a little bit more discussion to get to a recommendation. Does that sound okay, DSL?
I'd be curious, are there any other models that you'd like to compare it to?
No, I think what really needs to happen, Dana and Danielle, is the percentages are percentages, not dollar amounts.
Mhm.
And so when you're trying to figure 73% cost recovery 4 years from now, that's a different dollar amount than a 73% cost recovery today. And I think that's part of the confusion or whatever. And so you would need to actually do some new numbers for 73 and 85 if it were 4 years from now, or if it were 6 years from now, et cetera. That's part of the confusion I think that's happening. And I'm sorry, I'm a policy
Yep.
wonk.
That's a good way to phrase it though, Peggy. I
Mm.
mean, your explanation does give me some helpful context.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's the part it's really important is you're looking at a static number right now of 73%, but that's not the number that would be a 73% cost recovery in 4 years.
Yeah, that's a helpful way to say it.
That is helpful. I was just thinking deep into my brain and I'm not reaching a solution, but because all we have really is the numbers for the program, the average over the last 5 years that was prepared. It's an unknown of, as you say, what those will be in the future. So I'm trying to think, Danielle, the way we've outlined rule is that we would have certain amounts based on basically where we're trying to get to over the next 5 years. So,
and one of the reasons that the rule language only puts out a proposed 5-year fee schedule is because during that time, it'll allow us to kind of look at what we're actually recovering in the next couple of years and put together new data that would inform rulemaking in 5 years' time.
And that may help with Jessica's every 5 years concern about inflation costs.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy. Jessica, does that help with the inflation concern? I think I'm hearing, could be for the next 5 years, there's a 5% increase for inflation, but then after 5 years with the new rulemaking, that could be reevaluated.
Yeah, actually, I do like that. I think I did read the draft language at one point. I'm not sure if I remember that being super clear to me in reading it.
Yeah, it just has placeholders, and what we could do is put in the rule language that there will be a 5% increase every year, and then list out the fees, if that would be helpful. And so yeah, we could do that.
All right, well, I think we've,
Yeah.
oh, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking, so you'd list out what the fees will be.
Yes, so we would definitely put in the rule language, so there's placeholders where it's like effective July 1, 2026, tier 1 will be, and it's just an X. And so we just put placeholders in there because we didn't want to assume what the RAC would recommend and put in numbers prematurely.
And so that which I mean, I personally like, because then I think that people who go for their permit will know exactly what they're gonna pay and not be guessing or doing some math or thinking like, oh, well, it's 2027, so maybe it's this or that.
Yeah,
But just for my knowledge, to clarify, that number that's listed will include whatever cost recovery phasing we come up with, and then
Mhm.
also that 5% increase each year. That'll all be
Yes.
kind of bundled into that one number.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I like that. I think it's at least clear. I mean, at least people have certainty. They might not like it. They might not like the number, but at least they know it.
Mhm. Okay. So I think I'm hearing that maybe DSL could put together what the numbers would look like for the different years for the RAC to look at and see if that would be acceptable as a recommendation. Is that correct? DSL, does that sound like something you can do?
Yeah, would they like to see just the 5% compared to increasing to 73% so that there's two sets of numbers?
I think you have to have, you just need to do what the 5% is. And then at the 73% jump, you need to make sure that people understand that's a jump separate from the 5% a year.
Okay. I think that would be best served in, I don't know if I'm thinking on the fly about how to incorporate that into rule language versus just communicating it to the public.
Well, and not to go backwards, but I guess if we're phasing 60 to 85% program cost recovery over anything more than 5 years, but we're only saying that the 5% is approved for 5 years, then you almost are kind of showing, like, you can show how that cost recovery phase will happen, but if it goes over 5 years, like, that's going to continue for a couple years, and you can have your 5% inflation too, but then you kind of have an unknown inflation percentage after that, based on, I think, what I just heard, right?
I think I'm following along with you.
And I think our plan, Danielle, is around year 4 of these rules. You have to remind me what year that is, that we would need to propose like the next
Yeah.
5 years.
Yeah, year
That's
4
good.
is when we would need to enter into rulemaking, given how long our rulemaking process is. So that way we have something in place for year 6 by the time year 5 ends.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this might be like an unofficial, I guess. This might be me personally, not me representing LOC, but it seems like it would offer a lot more clarity to then have your transition from 60 to 85 program recovery happen in 5 years too. Like, to drag that out to 6 or 7 years, but you've only got your cost inflation factor set for 5 years is, then you're kind of got 2 different timelines.
Mm-hmm.
But I might need to just
So
think on that a little
Jessica, you're
longer.
suggesting that it would make more sense to do the 85% cost recovery at year 5.
Well, I see Peggy is shaking her head, so maybe I won't mess with it. If I was the one having to do the math, I would probably prefer that, but maybe I should stay quiet.
That's too soon. That's why I said 4 years at 60%, 4 years at 73%, 4 years at 85%. Actually, it takes 12 years to get to 85%. Now, somewhere in between there, and
Okay. So Peggy, I think what I thought you were saying is you wanted to go from 60 to 85% in 4 years, not in 4-year increments.
No, 4-year increments.
Okay, sorry, I must have not.
And the landlord might not agree with me, but I'm willing to help in the Samantha part of this conversation, because I know what it's going to cost for not only home builders, but for the ag industry and anybody who uses these permits. This is a huge shock. And we talked at the very beginning of this conversation of what a huge shock increase this is going to be. And so I want to make sure that we don't destroy the program by having the shock be too much too fast.
Okay, okay. That is much different than what I was thinking that you were pushing for, so that's helpful.
And Dana?
Yeah, it is helpful to see it written out. I guess my question is a little bit to Danielle. I don't remember anything magic about us choosing 5 years, other than that's typically when you reevaluate
It
the
was,
effect of your rule. So
yeah.
it does seem that we could put in fees for more or less than 5 years before we need to go back and do rulemaking. Obviously, we don't want to be doing rulemaking, and you all don't want to be part of the rulemaking too often. So maybe there's some balance there, but
Yeah, the caveat is to remember at any time we could enter into rulemaking. So if we find at year 4 that we're only at a 50% cost recovery, because of various reasons, we can go back and reevaluate and enter into rulemaking before we get to year 8. So I just want to put that out there. I'm not saying that that's what we're going to do. I'm just saying that we have the ability to enter into rulemaking at any time. And part of why we're putting in and projecting 5 years is so that way we don't have to do rulemaking continuously.
and to provide that predictability for,
Yes, to provide the predictability.
yeah.
But it could be possible to potentially include fewer or more years of fees in the rules. Okay. All right. Well, I know we're a little bit past when we wanted to take a break, so maybe we could take a little break now and then return. Is that okay with folks? Take a break. It's 10:50 now. Take a 15-minute break, get back together at 11:05. And then maybe we continue this discussion or just sort of like wrap it up and then go into one of the other topics for today. Okay. All right, then we'll resume at 11:05. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Hello. Okay, so we had a couple more topics on the agenda today, and I think we've had good discussion on the cost recovery piece. And because we have lost a few members of the RAC meeting today and don't have, and some folks weren't able to join today, we were able to just chat a little bit, DSL and myself, during our break here. We have a few recommendations on kind of how to move forward, and just maybe you want to check that with this group. I can go through those if you want, Dana and Danielle, or you can. Preference.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think that the team got some, so maybe on the cost recovery piece, the DSL team got some good direction on, looking towards a graduated 60 up through 85% cost recovery over a number of years. And they can come back with some numbers on what that would look like to have that level of cost recovery plus increases, the 5% annual increase, and can bring that information to you so you can see, what the actual numbers look like. And then in November, hold our meeting that's on the calendar and check with the group, does this look okay? Or is there a different recommendation that you all would have? So that's where we would propose going on the cost recovery piece. Does that sound like a good approach going forward? Okay. All right. And all right, thanks, Jessica. And I'll assume that's okay with Stephanie and Brad unless we say otherwise. And so they'll hopefully send those numbers by email, and please review them, and we'll really try to get everyone to come to the November meeting, because I think that will be the final meeting to discuss all of this. And then we had 2 other topics on the agenda today, which were the 3 impact statements and going over the comment tracker, which shows kind of how the rules were updated in response to your comments, or just kind of responses to some of your comments. But because there aren't a lot of RAC members here, we would suggest just, moving those over into the November meeting as well. And of course, in between now and November, if there's any comments you want to provide in writing on either the rule statements or DSL's responses to your comments, the comment tracker, you could definitely provide those by email too. Does that sound okay? All right, not seeing. Yeah, go ahead, Peggy.
Do we have, excuse me, do we have the impact statement, the housing impact statement? I don't know that we've seen that yet.
Yeah, it was one of the links in the email that Sylvia sent out with the materials that were posted to the DSL website. And I can just pop that rulemaking website into the chat.
That's okay. Thank you. It's on the website. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, great. So if that sounds good, we'll just shift everything over into the next meeting and give everyone more time to review things in their email, and we'll send out some communications to the full RAC on all of this and really stress the importance of that November meeting, and kind of full attendance at that one. And we'll probably shorten it to a 2-hour meeting, so that maybe that will make it easier for everyone to attend as well. Okay, so we do want to make sure that so those are the next steps. That's where we're wrapping up. We'll just, anything else from DSL or others on those pieces? All right, I don't want to not forget about the interested party comment period, so I will provide an opportunity for that. I think, Sean, you are our member interested party here, so I'll just check with you if you were planning to make a comment today. All right, I'm not hearing so we'll skip that piece here. But always appreciate you listening in and participating. Okay, we do want to flash up the next step slide, Danielle. I kind of went over all of our next steps, but if there was anything else you wanted to add, can do that and then wrap up today.
So I did not adjust this based on today's meeting, but it was going in thinking that this was potentially the last meeting, but these are also valid. So following this meeting, any revisions to the draft rule language and proposed fee tiers will be sent to the RAC members. And what that includes is also going to be some concrete fee numbers for what we're proposing in the different years. So that way there's not a placeholder, but there's to give you an idea of what those fees are going to look like. And then as always, we'll send out a meeting summary and the recording will be posted. Eventually the cost recovery recommendation will be presented to DSL leadership. And then also in advance of this, we're going to have our public comment period and public rule hearing in January. And we will specifically send notice to the RAC. So that way, regardless of if you're signed up for our email listserv for rulemaking, you'll receive a notice specifically. And then as always, all of our meeting materials are posted to our rulemaking website. Are there any questions? The date of the November meeting, Sylvia's put it in there, it's November 6th. I sent out those calendar invites last month.
I just wanted to write them on my just wanted to write it on my piece of paper here. So
Gotcha.
I want to clarify, the rules are going to be the director has been the designee to be able to adopt these rules, correct?
Yes.
It doesn't go to the state land board.
Correct.
Okay,
correct. But I think that let me not say that because I don't want to speak out of turn. But yes, these rules statutorily only require the director's approval and aren't required to go to the state land board for approval.
Yeah, thank you. Doesn't mean that they aren't going to be engaged. I just wanted to clarify that
Yeah.
that's exactly where that will happen.
Yes.
Because we will have a new state land board in January, and that's part of my thought process. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. All right. Well, anything else today? All right, well, thank you everyone for your continued engagement. Really appreciate it. And today was a really helpful conversation to see where everyone's at and kind of make some movement on the cost recovery model, and really looking forward to November and everyone's full participation there. We'll see you all November 6th, and we'll be in touch via email before then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
I need to stop the recording. Sorry.